or the late Wangari Maathai of Kenya on sustainable development. But we think that they all trained in the West. Mahabubul Haq and Amartya Sen studied in Cambridge, and Wangari Maathai in Pittsburgh, and Francis Deng studied in Yale. I've studied a whole bunch of these, what I call idea shifters. So people say, oh, this is all Western training. But one of the things I found when I did a study, which will be also part of a book, but there is a paper already in Third World Quarterly called Idea Shift. You can look at it. I found overwhelmingly, when they develop a new idea, they reject the Western idea that trained them. Overwhelmingly. They find that the training was almost useless. Muhammad Yunus, who got Nobel Prize for microfinance, Peace Prize, he came back to Bangladesh, and he writes in his autobiography, there was a famine in his hometown. He said, all my knowledge is useless. Because how do you get these people money when they cannot have a collateral? Even his Bangladeshi banks won't lend him money. So he developed ideas based on the local context. Mahabubul Haq developed human development looking back at the situation in Pakistan, and Amartya Sen has talked about it. He was a refugee from partition India, almost died, his family almost perished during the partition, and he lived with the Pakistani political experiment between swinging between civilian and political rule. Francis Deng was with the OAU and African Union, then of course the UN Secretary General's representative for internally displaced persons. A lot of his ideas came from Africa. The idea of responsible sovereignty is an African contribution, as Mohammed Sanoun, the co-chair of R2P Commission, said. Because it was Thabo Mbeki, it was the African leaders after the Somalia 1992 debacle, realized that the West doesn't care. So they have to take matters into their own hands, because the West cares more about Balkans than about the Great Lakes, for example. And if you look at it carefully, where this idea of responsible sovereignty came from, mostly it was an African innovation. Of course, it had other contributors, but I consider it, as Mohammed Sanoun would do, as an African contribution to human rights and humanitarian intervention, because they championed. It was the change from African OAU to African Union, and the fact that it is the only regional organization, AU, whose constitutive act includes a specific clause providing for humanitarian intervention and against genocide and large-scale atrocities, tells you that Africa played a very important role. So all I'm saying is you can find such ideas in climate change, also in CBDR, common but differentiated responsibility. So let me just conclude very quickly then by saying that an idea shift is occurring. It's not as visible and as fast as the global power shift, because we don't capture them, not because the ideas are not there. We don't capture them. We still study ideas in terms of where they were finally presented. So if there is a Geneva Agreement, or I love the UNDP, but UNDP did not create the human development idea, although it was the first articulation of the idea, implementation of that idea came from UNDP. But the idea came from the scholars, Mahabubul Haq and Amartya Sen, who were classmates in Cambridge. And a lot of that reflected their own background. Amartya Sen, the case of Bengal famine, for example. So responsible sovereignty, Francis Deng coined the term among a few others, but the Canadian-sponsored commission, R2P Commission, articulated it. So maybe the final articulation point of articulation of ideas are still in the West, although I hope that will change. Maybe the Delhi process will come up with ideas we can associate with the location. But the work, the thinking, and the context from which these ideas are done are overwhelmingly from the global South. And that's what matters, and we have to capture that with a new set of lenses, new set of conceptual tools. Also, very important, as I said, these ideas are not necessarily coming from the BRICS, with due respect. They are coming from all over. Pakistan, Bangladesh, microfinance, Kenya, Wangari Maathai. I went to do my field work with her Green Belt movement. It's amazing how ideas come from where. In fact, they come from the most unfortunate places in some cases, not from the settled and wealthy cities or countries of the world. But also important, and this is particularly important when you're talking about triangular cooperation. I only got to know about this a few days ago. There's such a thing. But I had thought exactly along those lines that in the old days, the ideas from the global south were mainly about rejection and resistance, fairly so, anti-colonial struggles, non-alignment, new international economic order. They were resisting existing paradigms and policy frameworks. But ideas increasingly, and they have legacy. I'm not saying that are gone away, non-alignment or neo or colonial struggles, anti-colonial struggles, they still have legacy. But increasingly I find in my survey of global ideas that they are more forward-looking, more problem-solving, not about resistance, but about solving problems. So ideas such as human security, human development, responsible sovereignty, they offer forward-looking vision. And they do also allow for not only South-South, but also North-South partnership. And this is where your triangular cooperation is very, very important, because you cannot dismiss the North, because it still has most of the institutions and outlets for knowledge creation and dissemination. So what I see as North-South, South-South, and South-North flow of ideas and synergy. And at the same time, Western principles and pathways of development, security, governance, and ecology, which offered in the beginning a very poor fit for the non-Western world, are being altered, localized, and new ones developed out of a global South context. So let me stop here. As I said, I have a number of articles and books on this, including one published in China recently, and I invite you to take a look at them. And thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thanks, Amitav. Thanks a lot. And I'm so glad that I decided to invite you. I'm so glad that you delivered the first address after Her Excellency inaugurated the conference. And I'm so glad that you said with rise of the rest, coercion would decline in the process of globalization. And that's why, Amitav, I feel South has to go for theorization of South-South cooperation. We can't be talking in channels and platforms where only governments interact. It is important that academics rise up to the occasion and respond to the heft that is required in the academic institutions, and we take the ideas of Western literature and Western theories, and as you rightly said, the power is shifting towards East, but is East academic prepared with their own explanation of the phenomenon? What Secretary Tirumurti very rightly said, non-monetized approach. So do we have non-monetized approach? I'm so glad that some of the examples that you gave are extremely clear that we do not pick up the ideas. Somebody who is sitting right in front, and my predecessor at RIS, Dr. Nagesh Kumar, came up with this idea of why it is important for FDI to have performance clause. But how many people are picking that up? Are we picking up that in our policy frameworks? That's where South doesn't celebrate South's own knowledge. And this, I think, is important. The UN agencies, Madam Excellency, under your leadership this year, as we celebrate BAPA plus 40, are expected, and I'm sure you would give a major fillip to this idea of knowledge creation within the South and providing a traction that the process requires. If BAPA plus 40 report, Mr. Shadwick, is again to be written by consultants from the North, I do not want a consultancy, but I'm saying that you should give chance to Southern scholars and Southern agencies who are not based in New York, who are not part of your usual network. So please bring in the scholars from the Nest, scholars from the South, and as Amitav very rightly said, bring in this knowledge up in terms of global sort of consideration. I'm very glad, Amitav, that I decided to invite you. Thanks for your address. Your book is on display outside. Those of you who want to purchase, it's there. I would also like to acknowledge now the presence of our director from South Center, which is one of the important institutions and partner with us, Carlos Correa, who is an important authority from the South on intellectual property rights. So thanks a lot. I also acknowledge young participants at our iTech course. Madam Excellency, we have 33 participants from 24 countries, and they are here discussing with us the idea of sustainable development goals. So friends, with this we come to an end of this session. We would have 15 minutes tea break and would be back here at 11:45. Thank you. Might have gathered from the inaugural session. This is the session. This is most important session. We should start in time. We have theoreticians, we have practitioners, all in this session, so that the talk that we have on theoretical framework for South-South cooperation is not pure academic exercise. And I'm extremely glad that the Chairman, Managing Director of Exim Bank has joined us here. David, a very close friend. He brings in the necessary connect that we should have of the theoretical framework with the practice. So as we discussed in the inaugural session, theoretical framework and empirical realities go hand in hand, and this is what this session is going to address. And two of the most eminent economists and commentators from the South are co-chairs of this. Carlos Correa is here from South Center, Geneva, and Professor Mustafizur Rahman from Bangladesh CPD. Both are extremely impactful voices, and I hand over the floor to them. The division of labor between the co-chairs is already laid out in our email, so they know it very well. So Carlos and Professor Mustafizur Rahman, now the floor is to be shared by you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure for me to be here and to meet so many friends. And the honor of chairing this session with these very important, distinguished panelists. So thank you very much again for this opportunity on behalf of the South Center. As you know, this is an intergovernmental organization of the South. This is a think tank for the South that works in different areas which have been discussed and will be discussed during the session, in particular South-South cooperation. So since we haven't got too much time, let me just start with the session. I will ask the panelists to make presentation for just 10 minutes maximum. I will need to be a little strict about this. And then the commentators perhaps for 5 minutes each in order to be able to get the lunch time. So the first panelist is Professor Mohanty from RIS. Professor Mohanty, please.
Thank you very much. At the very outset, I would like that Development Cooperation Fund is very much important for developing countries, but it is important that it is now declining. The most important aspect is that apart from the traditional donors, new emerging donors are joining consistently and also contributing the whole process. Now, with developed countries, they have got very strong theoretical background to support their whole development process. Washington consensus is one where most of the issues are very rightly articulated, but it is always discussed that developing countries are, though very strongly engaged in development cooperation process, but they don't have very strong theoretical underpinning to support their processes. So there are two schools which have been there, and the monetary and structuralist in the last 75 years. There are new experiments with that to see that how conditionality issues are very strongly dealt with the different schools. But the fact is that the conditionality issues are almost rejected by the recipients. The emerging issue, one can say that during the last 75 years, particularly after the post-war period, two different schools emerged, monetarist and structuralist. Monetarists strongly view that development or growth can take place when you have got macroeconomic stability. And DAC process is very much associated with the monetarist approach. The entire Bretton Woods institutions are also supporting the whole process. Then Paris Declaration, Washington Consensus, monetary approach to balance of payments, all those theoretical developments are supporting or part of the monetary approach. The structuralists, on the other hand, argue is that there is underemployment equilibrium which is very much there, and structural